Two of the best teams in college basketball square off in a round of 32 game, both with 5+ year streaks of making the Sweet 16 on the line. Parker Ainsworth and I from Locked On Cougars chop it up in today's crossover edition of Locked On Zags.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today is a special crossover edition of the Locked On Zags podcast. I'm joined by Parker Ainsworth of Locked On Cougs, longtime friend and friend of the program. Very excited to get a chance to talk with Parker about this matchup. We're talking about whether Gonzaga was underseeded, Houston's physicality, their dominance in the Big 12, comparing Houston to St. Mary's, comparing Gonzaga to Arizona and some of their prior matchups. All of that and more in today's episode. Check it out.
And I'm your host of Locked On Cougs, Parker Ainsworth, joined by Andy Patton of Locked On Zags and Locked On College Basketball, and that Amazon breakdown thing we keep talking about. Go check that out as well. But Andy, as guys covered a lot of college basketball, I usually start these with a weird question, but today's question is about a weirdness. How is this a round of 32 matchup?
Right? Yeah, it's pretty wild. When I saw the bracket come out, we were expecting Gonzaga to be 7 seed. I was vaguely hopeful they would end up being a 6 seed. We saw this kind of last year where Gonzaga had a bit of a discrepancy with not winning as many big games, and the games that they did schedule in the non-conference didn't end up aging very well, and they finished the season strong. And last year they ended up climbing all the way to a 5 seed. Now, part of that was the committee having to accommodate BYU, who wasn't going to play on Sundays. BYU got a 6 seed last year. Gonzaga got a 5 seed. They went to the Sweet 16, beat Kansas in the second round, et cetera, et cetera. And so we kind of thought maybe that'll happen this year, but no. Committee gave them an 8 seed. Felt a little disrespectful, just in terms of the committee not knowing what to do with a team that had the metrics absolutely loved them. I mean, the computer metrics are all about Gonzaga this year. The net was 8th. Their Ken Pom coming into the tournament was 9th. Their Torvik, I think, was 10th or 11th. Like, they were considered a consensus top 10 team everywhere. That kind of strips away the human element of evaluating these teams. But the human element ultimately matters. And Gonzaga they didn't play a lot of teams that made the NCAA tournament. Didn't play a lot of teams that got high seeds in the tournament. Some of that was just bad luck. Who knew that Baylor and UConn and UCLA and West Virginia and San Diego State and et cetera, would all kind of stumble and not get very high seeds in the tournament. But Gonzaga also didn't win nearly enough of those games. And I think that was the issue, is that this team, Ken Pom has the luck factor data, which just showed that Gonzaga was one of the unluckiest teams in the country because they lost so many close games. They lost 3 of their 8 games in overtime, very few bad losses, no blowout losses. But Mark Few would be the first to tell you, yeah, we get the luck element, but we don't consider losing those games unlucky. We didn't execute down the stretch. It's not unlucky that Ryan Nembhard missed a free throw against UCLA at the end of the game. It's not unlucky that Gonzaga gave up 18 3-pointers to Santa Clara at home. Like, those are not things that are unlucky. Those are just not executing when you need to execute. And so the committee looked at this team that the computer said, well, this team should be really, really good. And the resume said, well, they haven't really done it. They haven't really, they beat St. Mary's, a great win, but they only beat them once out of 3 times. So they ultimately kind of sided with the human element and the actual on-court results, which gave them an 8 seed. And it looked like that might have been a mistake. Certainly after the way that they played against Georgia, just dominated them from the very start of that basketball game, was never even remotely a competition for a full 40 minutes. Mark Few's tenure as Gonzaga's head coach in the first round has been remarkable. They haven't lost a first-round game since Steph Curry was at Davidson, because it was to Steph Curry at Davidson that they lost. So maybe this would have happened regardless. But yeah, I feels like Houston Gonzaga would have been a really awesome Elite 8 game, at least a Sweet 16 game. If Gonzaga had gotten like that 5 seed, it could have been a 1 versus 5 matchup in there. But alas, for Gonzaga, they have to play an incredibly good team to even continue their Sweet 16 streak. And Houston, this is probably not the draw that a lot of Cougs fans were looking forward to in terms of needing to beat this team to get to the Sweet 16 as well.
Yeah, and I want to get to predictive, and I want to talk about matchups. But as far as history goes, especially before Houston got to the Big 12, this was 2 fairly well-regarded group of
Mhm.
five level. Gonzaga, having run the West Coast for a long time. Both teams were in the 2021 Final Four, and both teams played that great Baylor team and all that, right? Like both of the kind of feel similar in that sense. We talked in pre-pod. If it weren't for Jordan Poole's shot in 2018, this would be a longer Sweet 16 streak for Houston, going up against Gonzaga, which is the longest at 9, if I'm saying if I'm correct there. Just a lot of, and 2 great coaches, Hall of Fame caliber guys, and a few in Sampson. And to have all of that come down in the round of 32, I mean, this is the kind of thing where there'll be games on all day. It's the late night game, so I guess it kind of stands on its own a little bit in that way, but it almost feels like it's lost in the shuffle, except that it's 2 like powerhouse kind of matchups. And I gotta be honest, Houston folks, I think from Sampson on down to my own household would tell you, if you're going to beat someone, it doesn't really matter when you play. You're going to have to beat them at some point anyway. Like to win a title, you have to beat good teams. You don't get away from that. It just feels like this is happening very quickly. I don't know how else to put it besides like this was supposed to feel more like a good American team or something like that, and kind of moving on. And instead, it's legitimately a team that, from KenPom and metrics, like you said, has every right to feel like they could be a top 10 team in America. And I want to ask about one matchup, because you mentioned like the schedule didn't do any favors. The teams you played weren't any good, but you opened the season blowing the doors off of Baylor.
Yeah, that was good.
And Houston has had a couple. I mean, Houston won the games, and Houston plays a slow down style. You're not going to score 1,000 points anyway, or anything like that with these kind of the way Houston plays. But Houston Baylor games weren't 40-point blowouts, and Gonzaga opened up the year like that. Does that not feel like it's kind of a comparative thing between these two?
Yeah, it does a little bit. And I think I wouldn't put a ton of stock into it for a couple of reasons. One, that wasn't an anomaly of a performance for Baylor. They weren't great this year. I think it's pretty clear that this Baylor team was when Gonzaga beat them by 38 points, Baylor was the 8th ranked team in the country. They at no point in this season looked like the 8th best team in the country. Like they're not a bad team, but they were never that good. I think we learned that not just from that game, but pretty quickly after that. It was like, oh, this team they're not, the depth in the front court's not good. They had various other issues that I don't think we foresaw before the season, but that was also about the best Gonzaga looked. They looked really good in that game, and then they looked good against San Diego State in the second half, but they stumbled against Arizona State. They won that game, but it was pretty gross. And then they get into the battle for Atlantis. They lose the first-round game to West Virginia, who ended up being better than we thought, and then crumbled, and then didn't make the tournament and all that chaos that happened with them. But for Gonzaga, they went through a really bad lull period for almost 2 months, really, before they kind of finally found themselves again, made some adjustments to the rotation, got some more defensive focused players, some more playing time, and kind of righted the ship towards the end of the year. But that Baylor game was unique in the sense that Baylor didn't seem fully prepared for the season to begin. They were dealing with injuries. Jaden Nunn didn't play, or I think Langston Love didn't play in that game. And I think they just, with new starters at point guard and center is about the toughest positions in college basketball to have new players. And they, of course, had Jeremy Roach, who has since been replaced by Rob Wright in that starting lineup, and then Norchad Omier, who's fantastic. But I think they were still trying to find their way, whereas Gonzaga brought back 7 of their 8 rotation players. So I think in that game in particular was kind of just, hey, we've all done this before. We kind of know how to play together, and we were ready to go. And then as the season went on, Gonzaga's some of their weaknesses got exposed a little bit more. But at the end of the day, I think if you were looking for something to be optimistic about as a Gonzaga fan, if you were looking for something to make you a little bit more nervous as a Houston fan, the fact that Gonzaga beat Baylor by a much bigger margin than Houston did, and the fact that one of Houston's very, very few losses this season was to San Diego State, a team that Gonzaga beat at San Diego State. And San Diego State didn't play all that well in the Mountain West Conference, and then they got torched by North Carolina, which doesn't make that win look make that loss look great for North Carolina, or for Houston, excuse me. But Gonzaga and Houston both played San Diego State in November. So that result carries a little bit of weight, I think. And so that makes it interesting, but Houston has just a trophy case more good wins this year than Gonzaga does. So they've proven it in a way that Gonzaga hasn't. But yeah, the Baylor San Diego State element is something I'm keeping an eye on in this game too.
You mentioned integrating new players, talking about Baylor, and I think you're being pretty modest in something I want to mention about Gonzaga in 1 second, as well as some more of these kind of weird commonalities between between the two teams here. Before we get too far, I do want to remind folks that today's show is brought to you by Nissan. Our buddies over at Nissan here to tell you that we're all about the stats. That's why we do things like break down basketball games with stats and analytics, but numbers don't lie. That's why we use them so often. When it comes to new Nissan Armada Pro 4X, numbers are on an MVP level. They total up to 8,500 pounds. Literally the whole team plus the gear wherever you need to go. It's powered by a twin-turbo V6 engine, delivering the strength and performance to handle highways, back roads, and everything in between. Room for up to 8 people. Their Armada Pro 4X is built for big crews, big adventures, even bigger memories. And while you're off exploring off-road trails, or rolling up to an arena like this one on Saturday night at 7:40 p.m., it's a whole other thing. The Armada Pro 4X brings power, versatility, and style wherever you go. Take your adventures to new heights. The all-new Nissan Armada Pro 4X. Learn more at nissanusa.com. And today's show is also brought to you by our buddies over at 5 Hour Energy. Daylight saving time kind of snuck up on some of us. If you're feeling a lost hour of sleep, or just feeling toddlers like Andy and myself might, we try to stay up late and watch a basketball game, that 5 Hour Energy has your back. The extra sunshine means more time for fun, but sometimes you need a little extra boost to power it through. When you're up late watching these NCAA tournament games, squeezing in a round of golf after work, or just busy trying to keep up with your day, 5 Hour Energy helps give you that quick, refreshing pick-me-up whenever you need it. I like the on-the-go convenience. It fits in a pocket, fits in your sock if you wear tall sock. It fits wherever you are. Head to 5hourenergy.com for 15 flavors to choose from, including watermelon, blue raspberry, peach mango. You can even build your own 12-pack or 24-pack delivered right to your door. If you need one now, grab 5 Hour Energy shot at your local grocery store or convenience store. They're everywhere. Stock up today and stay energized. All right, Andy, and talking about Baylor, you're trying to give them some credit and be like, okay, they introduced Jeremy Roach. They brought in North Chandomir. And I would, for a non-Coug, I love watching North Chandomir play basketball. He's really fun to watch because he just plays so hard. But you failed to mention in that your own Gonzaga Bulldogs bring in one Khalif Battle, who Houston fans remember that the first year this show was around actually was the 22-23 season, and Khalif Battle was on that Temple team that ended Houston's undefeated season in January of that year. Or I guess an undefeated at home season, then they were number one team in the country at the time, whatever. And Khalif Battle had a really good game in that game. As far as matchups go, as someone who's watched every game multiple times, what can you tell us about Khalif Battle's brought to Gonzaga? He's double-digit points per game guy wherever he goes and that kind of stuff. But Gonzaga is a unique situation.
Yeah, Battle's fit at Gonzaga has been unique. And I think for anybody who's watched a full season of Khalif Battle as opposed to just watching a few games, like you kind of get, you start to get it more. Like if you watch highlights of him, you're like, oh, wow, that kid is incredible. Or you watch, just the last 7 games he played at Arkansas where he averaged like 30 points a game and just went insane. And it's like, wow, this kid's incredible. But the consistency is such a huge issue. And I think it's exacerbated in Gonzaga's system because what we saw throughout the year so many times was there's too many cooks in the kitchen. Gonzaga's offense is always going to be driven by paint touches. It's always going to be if we're in the half court, if we can get out and run, great. If we can't get out and run, we're going to get in our half court offense. We're going to do either high ball screens with Graham Ike or Braden Huff, get them rolling down towards the rim, especially with, for the last 5 years, one of the Nembhards running the show has been elite in the pick and roll. Or it's just swing the ball around the key and try to find a way to get Graham open down low, get him the ball, let him go to work. And so when the offense is so based on those two players, I think Battle was adjusting to being like almost an off-ball shooter role, which was like the last thing he should be. He's a mediocre 3-point shooter, and he's a great slasher. And I think they consistently found ways to get him the basketball in the corner where his ability to drive to the rim, draw contact, get to the free throw line was really limited. So Battle just settled for launch and threes. made them at a below average pace, and it was kind of stagnating Gonzaga's offense. And then when they made an adjustment to have him come with the second unit for a while, that really kind of got him going, got him engaged in the offense where he could be more of an on-ball creator, get screens set for him, go towards the rim. I mean, he's one of the best free throw shooters in the country. I think he's third in free throw percentage. He drew so many fouls at Arkansas, never quite got that same volume here at Gonzaga, but at times we'll have games where he'll go 12 of 13 from the line, and you're like, oh, that's right. That's what he is capable of doing, and how he can just bend a defense. I'm better than anybody Gonzaga's ever had. And for people who listen to my show on a regular basis, I've probably used this quote that Mark Few said before the season 6 or 7 different times, and it carries a different weight every time. But Mark Few said before the season that they've never had a player like Khalif Battle. And at times I'll cite that as like, this is why it's so frustrating, because the staff doesn't know what to do with him. They're trying to shove him into the role of Steel Venters, who suffered a season-ending injury before the year, who was like a 44% three-point shooter at Eastern Washington, who was going to be a standstill corner three-point shooter. That's not who Khalif Battle is. And so you'd see Gonzaga struggle to find a way to utilize him. But then when he did, when it worked, when he engaged in the offense the right way, this team is unbelievably good. And we saw that against Georgia. I mean, you can tell in the first 3 minutes of a game if Khalif Battle is going to be that version. And when he's that dude, this team is unbelievable. And again, 24 points in that game. He was hitting his threes. He was getting downhill. He was engaged defensively, which doesn't always happen. He's coming off 2 straight great games on that end of the floor. He had 5 steals against St. Mary's, which was a season high, might have been a career high for him. And so he's kind of the X factor, it feels like, in almost every Gonzaga game. Like, I almost get tired of always listing him, but he really is. It's like, you know what Ryan's going to give you, you know what Graham's going to give you. But for Battle, he had, I think, like seven conference games where he had 5 or less points, and then like 8 conference games where he had 15 or more points. And it was like, you didn't really know which version you were getting, but you felt a lot better about Gonzaga's chances of winning if you got that good version of him. And so far, so good for him in the NCAA tournament. We'll see what he can do against significantly. Georgia's a good defense, but Houston's better. So I'm curious how Khalif will respond in that game.
Well, you mentioned 2 consistents they've had in Ike and Nembhard. And I almost feel like, weirdly, Houston's probably going to have more success cutting that stuff off with Juwan Roberts or Tug, I guess, whichever matchup they want to go with on Ike. And then I assume Uzan's going to get Nembhard on the other side or outside. And I kind of almost feel like that makes the Battle matchup more important, right? He and I would assume Emmanuel Sharp when he's on the floor. And I don't know, am I crazy to think that Houston defensively is okay at the point guard and forward spots? It's these kind of wings and stuff like that where you got a little more size at Gonzaga that could swing things? Or is that kind of a spot where, I mean, you watch all of college basketball coasting both shows, I guess. I feel like Houston can actually win those 2 matchups, weirdly, even though they're on every metric Houston Gonzaga's best 2 players.
Yeah, I think they can. And I think that does make the Battle kind of dynamic more interesting, because longer, rangier guards have been able to slow down Ryan Nembhard. There is virtually nothing that man can't do, but he can't grow 4 inches. He's 6 foot and he's barely that. Like, he's just not very big, and he works really hard defensively. I hate calling him a bad defender because he's not, but he's just so limited in what he can do on that end because of his size. And in the West Coast Conference, that rarely is a factor. But even against somebody like Augustus Marcelonis at St. Mary's, who's got some size on him, that became a bit of a challenge. So I think that is an area where Houston can win on both ends, not because Ryan Nembhard's bad or anything, just because I think the size is a problem. And Ike will struggle against physicality more. I mean, most bigs struggle against Houston's bigs. That's just part of the deal.
Yeah, and I mean that pejoratively. I think we've had success there against most people we've played. I think that's really where I'm coming from on it.
Right. And I think the key for Gonzaga is that they have, if Graham doesn't have a good game, you need Braden to have a good game. And Braden Huff coming off the bench, 15 minutes a game, he just scored 18 points. I say coming off the bench, he's actually started the last 2 games, but for most of the season came off the bench. He's 6'11", and Graham's 6'10" or whatever. And so they have a height advantage on Houston, but they need to be physical enough to hang with them. And I think few teams have been able to do that with a ton of success against Houston, but Gonzaga, they've played better in physical games lately. I mean, they won an absolute rock fight against St. Mary's in the WCC championship game. Georgia's a physical team. Every single player in the pregame press conference mentioned their physicality is like, hey, this is something we need to work on. And Georgia did a good job on the offensive glass, and they didn't do a good job of really anything else in that game, which is what Gonzaga was able to do so effectively. But yeah, I do think that if Sharp or Arsenault or whoever is on Khalif Battle, one thing, like if Battle's trying to get downhill constantly and able to do that, that's a huge disadvantage for Houston because it'll either put their bigs in foul trouble or he'll get shots at the rim. But I also wonder, just from the simple fact of like, if Khalif Battle's just running crazy on offense, trying to get actions going, even if Sharp does a good job on him, you do limit Sharp's ability to be impactful offensively because he's going to be working extra hard on defense. And I think that's one kind of area that Gonzaga can exploit teams a little bit, is because their offense is so fast moving and constantly going that I think they kind of wear teams down. Houston's not going to be an easy team to do that to, especially because they're not going to play at a particularly fast pace. So I think whoever can come into this game and dictate the pace that they want to play at will be successful. I have a feeling Kelvin Sampson has watched as many possible hours of Gonzaga St. Mary's games as he can, because there's really only been one coach who's routinely successful at slowing Gonzaga down, and that's Randy Bennett and the Gales. And Houston has better athletes and I think has the ability to do that. And if Gonzaga gets caught in that, they're going to have some serious issues because they really struggle to play outside of their pace. But if Houston gets sped up, that's going to be a big advantage for Gonzaga, and certainly could wear some of those guys out, at least in terms of being able to be impactful on both ends of the floor.
Well, and before we get, because this is going a little long now, because I want to sit on this for a second, I do feel like Gonzaga is the mirror image of Houston in a lot of ways out in the West Coast Conference, in that it is a work hard program built on defense, built on, frankly, at a very different size school, a different size conference in the Big 12 right now, finding guys that fit a system, not guys that necessarily have the star ratings and stuff like that. And if it hits both, that's great, but that's not the point, right? I don't mean to spoil this. I think on the bracket show, you did pick Houston in this. Is that because of that mirror image, or is that because of something else that I'm not thinking of?
There's a couple of things. One, I wasn't expecting Gonzaga to look quite that good against Georgia. I think they looked great. I thought they would win, obviously, but if they play like that, they can beat anybody in the country. I firmly believe that. But yeah, I think for Houston, what Kelvin Sampson has done so well, and I think you're absolutely spot on about it, kind of the mirror image thing of being able to find the kind of players that fit your system. And I think that's getting progressively harder and harder in college basketball with players able to, roster movement is more fluid and money becomes a factor. And so I think you see teams that are some teams are having to settle for, like, we're going to get the players that we can, and we're going to figure out how to work around them. And I think the best programs in the sport get players to fit the system that they want to operate out of. And very few, I would put these two teams at the very near or at the very top of the list in terms of being able to consistently do that without necessarily needing, like, the 5 of the 30 best freshmen in the country. Like, Gonzaga's never done that. Houston's never really done that. They got a good couple of classes lately, but that's not been their MO for the most part. Gonzaga thrives in the transfer portal, but they also thrive. And Braden Huff was a non-top 100 prospect. And they got a backup center now who was not a super highly known guy, who looks like he's going to be another good low post dominant player in the future as well, because they just find these kind of guys. And so I think that these two programs being great at that is a huge reason for their success. But I think Houston right now, is so good at having, they have so much intentionality on offense. I think, one of the things that I was talking about on over the weekend with the bracket breakdown show, I don't know if we got it on the air or not, but Houston is one of the 5 best teams in the country in terms of 3-point shooting by percentage, but they don't take very many threes. And on one hand, it's like the conversation we were having was like, well, should Houston be considered one of the best 3-point shooting teams if their volume is so low? Like, wouldn't you rather have a team that shoots way more threes at a slightly worse clip? And there's kind of elements of that make sense. But for Houston, like, just looking at the box score and looking at their stats, the guys who are good 3-point shooters take a lot of threes. The guys who aren't don't. Like that. It's right. Honestly, it doesn't feel like it's much more complicated than that. There's 3 good shooters on this team. They all take 5+ threes per game. Everybody else doesn't shoot threes. Gonzaga's a bad three-point shooting team this year because they have a lot of guys who aren't very good three-point shooters who take a lot of threes, which they shouldn't be doing. So it just feels to me like Houston's so set in knowing what they want to do. And that's a huge testament to Sampson's ability to get buy-in from his guys and know what he wants to do as a coach, while also finding the right players to fit that system.
You mentioned the bracket breakdown, which reminds me.
The NCAA tournament is here, and so is the Bracket Breakdown. Locked On Podcast Network and Amazon Fire TV channels are teaming up to deliver NCAA tournament coverage like never before. Watch studio shows featuring former players and Locked On's local experts as they guide you through every upset, buzzer beater, and bracket matchup. Stream it all for free on Amazon Fire TV channel. Search Bracket Breakdown to see it all for free. It's your team every day.
What a good-looking couple guys there, huh? So you mentioned that Houston is very smart in their shot selection, and I actually think Houston's offense and St. Mary's offense is another reason that I draw this comparison. That they both play incredibly slow pace.
Yeah.
Both very comfortable shooting an end of shot clock shot and spending the first 25 of 30 seconds just kind of figuring out what they want to do. They have guys that make shots in good spots. They don't get into other spots, for lack of a better phrase. And I almost feel like that's got to be really frustrating too for Gonzaga, because Gonzaga wants to play. It's not quite 7 seconds or less Suns, but they want to play fast. They want to play high scoring games. And it's what they're really good at. They kind of turned that on. I think the clip everyone showed from the Georgia game, the box score that everyone's screenshot was 27-3 at the gate. Right, it was a multi-touchdown lead, and I don't think that Houston never wants to do that against anybody. And there some stat that Evan Maya points out is Houston is up hearing all these analytics, but it's so far behind in 10-0 runs. It's because they took them forever to score 10 points. That's 5 minutes of basketball. And so I kind of feel like Houston's got an advantage there too. Ken Palm's got this at a game where both teams are just under 70. FanDuel thinks it's a 4.5 point. Houston by 4.5, I should say. Do you think the scoring am I crazy to think that 73 sounds like a lot of points?
Yeah, I mean, no, I don't think you're crazy for thinking that, but I do think it'll be interesting to see. I think that's right around the marker that Gonzaga is probably eyeballing of hey, we feel like we win this game if we score 75, but if we're under 65, that's not going to be good enough. And I think for Gonzaga, the fact that they are used to a team that does what Houston does, the scale is a little bit different. The level of athletes and physicality that Houston has compared to St. Mary's is a little bit different. But St. Mary's is a great offensive rebounding team. I know Houston is as well. St. Mary's has a ton of size too. Mitchell Saxon's he's been at St. Mary's since I think 2010 or so, but he's a 7-foot monster who's a great rebounder. So Gonzaga's kind of used to going up against teams that play slow, that take end of shot clock shots comfortably, and that offensively rebound well. And we saw Gonzaga finally make the adjustment in that third game against St. Mary's. And like I said, win a rock fight. They're not very good at winning rock fights. This is why they've, with the exception of a couple of NCAA tournament appearances, they struggle against UCLA in the non-conference when they play Mick Cronin's team because of that same thing, because that team likes to do that slow-paced, grind you out defensively type battles. And so I think for Gonzaga, the fact that they've historically struggled in these games is cause for concern for the fan base, but they're also comfortable having played them a handful of times and coming off of that win against the Gales. But these two teams are 360th and 359th in tempo. So you're not wrong to compare them in that specific space. And the efficiency levels are very high. And I think, for Gonzaga, making them work for 26, 27 seconds defensively, you're going to get them to break down. Most teams at the college level break down. If you can be patient offensively, you're going to get looks. And I think that is where Houston has an ability to really make this a challenge for Gonzaga. If they can not only use a lot of clock and be patient and find efficient shots, but if they can clean up on the offensive glass, that's just absolutely devastating for Gonzaga. But it's worth pointing out that one of the ways Gonzaga countered that physicality and rebounding from St. Mary's was by starting the two bigs, Graham Ike and Braden Huff, together. I know I mentioned that earlier, but I'll mention it again. I expect those two guys to both start in this game, and that'll give Gonzaga a couple inches in the front court in both spots. And again, Houston has out-rebounded teams that have more size than them a lot this year, a lot this year. So it doesn't mean that it's going to happen again, but it is something that you kind of have to throw out a lot of Gonzaga's results this year because they didn't play. They've only played 2 games this season where they started those 2 guys together, and it was a win over a very good St. Mary's team and a win over a Georgia team. So that's kind of a new thing for this team.
Well, and so I want to ask about this too on the inverse of this. I compare Houston and St. Mary's a lot, and then in trying to find teams on Houston's schedule that look like Gonzaga to me, I have kind of likened them to a BYU. And frankly, if I'm being honest with you, Andy, going into the second BYU matchup in the Big 12 tournament, I was like, hey, this team is really good. It's a lot better team than we played in January when Houston held them to 55 points.
Right.
And they kind of hit their stride. Yegor Dimon is a pro top 10 pick.
Yeah.
They shoot the ball really well. Richie Saunders is really good. And then they went off and held them to 54 in the Big 12 tournament. And so I happily ate crow in that one because it was not the good game I thought it was going to be. But am I crazy to think that like Houston fans should feel comfortable because Gonzaga is a similar team to BYU as well? And while it's Houston as St. Mary's on steroids and you've got Gonzaga as BYU on steroids, they're both better than their comparative person in this. I think Houston's done fine against a high-scoring, high-paced kind of team, admittedly, even if it's a little bit bigger.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I think Gonzaga is also fairly similar to Arizona, which is a team that Houston also had success against, but albeit
closer games.
Closer, right. For the difference, I think, in my mind is that Arizona is like a borderline top 10 offense at KenPom, and they're about a top 30, I think 35-ish defense. Gonzaga's higher offensively, but they're about 26th defensively, so they're very similar in terms of their adjusted efficiency on KenPom, whereas BYU, I think, is like 70th defensively. Right, so I think that's a big difference is that I don't think Gonzaga is a great defensive team. I think their defensive efficiency numbers are heightened in part by getting to play Portland twice a year and San Diego and the teams like that. But they've improved dramatically defensively in the last like month of the season. And I think that is where like a month ago, Gonzaga's profile looked a lot like BYU's. Now it looks a little bit more like Arizona's, which is to say that they're just a little bit better defensively. I think they have BYU's got some size Keba Kaita is a great player for them, and I think he helps them defensively. He helped them a lot in that first round game against VCU, but I think it's kind of a mix of those two teams in some ways. A big difference for Gonzaga is that they're not as good of a three-point shooting team as either of them. And Arizona's not – actually, Arizona's arguably worse. They're both kind of bad. But I think that's a big problem for Gonzaga. The best versions of Gonzaga basketball, the ones that went to the national championship game or have been routinely top 5 seeds, have been kind of a lot of what this team is, but they've been really good three-point shooting teams. According to KenPom, this is the worst three-point shooting Gonzaga team, period, like ever, like since KenPom started in 1997. So since Mark Few took over in 99, and it's like barely, but still, and it's honestly, the data might be changed after they made 12 threes against Georgia in that game, but this is not a good shooting team for Gonzaga. And I think everything that they want to do, from the paint touches to the transition offense to the pace, is helped significantly by being able to space the floor and drill threes. And when this team's not doing that, it's a significant problem. So I think the BYU Arizona comps are fair. I think those are teams that Houston would kind of look to, like, what did we do effectively against these teams and how will it work against Gonzaga? Obviously the difference with BYU is they don't really have a low post, like feed the ball down low type presence, whereas Arizona doesn't really either, but they do that sometimes. At least they've done it in the past with Umar Ballo for sure. But I think that's those are fun comps, and that's why I think the Big 12 is so great for a school like Houston or for anybody. Is like you kind of play a lot of different styles, so you get in the tournament a bit more prepared because you've seen a little bit of everything.
Well, and as much I think very highly of Mark Few as a coach, obviously. I think anyone who watches basketball would. A lot of great coaches in the Big 12. You kind of see 2 a week, it feels like, for at least 2 months of the season. Andy, this game is late at night on Saturday. You're going to have your 5-hour interview to get ready for it, and then you're on your way to Texas for bracket breakdown stuff. But where can we find all that, and then we'll get it on out of here because people get you ready for this one.
Yeah. So you can find me Locked On College Basketball Podcast, Locked On Zags Podcast. You can find either of those wherever you're listening to Locked On Cougs. If you're listening there, you can find it on YouTube. The bracket breakdown stuff, for those who haven't checked it out yet, it's on Amazon Fire TV. So if you have an Amazon Fire TV stick, You plug that in, you go to the main page. It's right there. It shows up right away, which is very startling. You pop it on and boom, there we are. We're having such an absolute blast getting to do this Sunday and Mondays for the next couple of weeks. Myself, my co-host Isaac Shade for Locked On College Basketball. We're joined by some phenomenal analysts, Gordon Hayward, longtime NBA all-star Butler legend, Kylan Mills, who hosts Locked On Warriors and is a host for the Big Ten Network, Monique Billings, who plays in the WNBA. Like, we have a lot of really fun people on this show getting to break down the NCAA tournament and everything that's going down. And it's worth checking out. Amazon Fire TV. You can find it on social medias as well. Parker, I'm really looking forward to this game. I think it's going to be an incredibly fun, exciting matchup, probably the best one on Saturday's slate. I'm also looking forward to Auburn-Creighton. That's going to be a really fun one as well. But these are two really, really good teams. And I meant to mention this earlier. The fact that this is not even the most like exciting or Hall of Fame level coaching matchup on Saturday is just criminal, because Samson Few is elite, but you can't really beat Patino Calipari, which is what we're getting with St. John's in Arkansas. So it's just unfortunate that it's like that. Gonzaga Houston doesn't even get to hold that mantle for this game, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's the best game of the day.
I think it's going to be the best finish. It's going to be end of the day finish, too, for a lot of folks. And so kind of a cherry on top for a Saturday of March Madness. I'd argue the best Saturday because games all day long, but we'll do that debate at a different time. Andy Patton, Parker Andrew, Locked On crossover. I always wrap up by saying go Cougs, but I'm not going to make you say it, Andy, so go Cougs.